If I asked you to picture a wealthy Victorian businessman who owned and ran one of the biggest employers in the city, held positions in both local and national government, was a supplier and good friend to many high-ranking politicians and members of several royal families, you might conjure to mind someone who wouldn't be out of place in a Charles Dickens novel. Miserly, cruel, uncaring for those under him, totally corrupted by his own power, and seemingly untouchable by all accounts. Now, I'm not saying that this kind of person never existed, they most certainly did, but the subject of today's presentation seems to run counter to this narrative in almost every way. Jeremiah James Colman was born on the 14th of June 1830 in Stoke Holy Cross near the city of Norwich in Norfolk. Born to James Colman and into the already fairly successful Colman family, who had been making mustard on a site in Stoke Holy Cross since 1814, and in a smaller way since around 1800. The company itself had been founded by his uncle, who was also called Jeremiah. In his youth he was educated in the Poringland Company School for the first few years, before finishing off his formal education under a private tutor, while also being brought up by his family in the Colman's liberal, nonconformist beliefs. At the age of 17, he was ready to join the family business that was being run by his uncle and father, helping in a junior role for a few years, until 1851, when he was brought in to a more prominent position after his uncle's retirement and death shortly after, on the 3rd of December 1851, aged 74, and leading to a change in name from Colmans of Norwich to J. Colmans. The father and son duo would have a rather short partnership, sadly ending with the death of James on the 24th of November 1853, leaving 24-year-old Jeremiah in sole control of a company with around 200 employees, making mostly mustard and cornstarch. He was understandably worried about the great weight that had been placed upon him at a relatively young age. And his worry was not just about the possibility of running the company his family had worked so hard for into the ground, but the fear that the money and influence it was going to bring him might go to his head and change him not for the better. Fortunately, his mother was there to reassure him and keep his mind on the work through those troubling few years of anxiety. Fortunately, one thing Jeremiah certainly was throughout his entire life was a very hard worker. And after taking some time to settle into the role, one of the biggest tasks he took up as a new owner was far from an easy one, and a rather surprising one. He had noticed that almost all of the employees who worked at their mill came from Norwich, and had to travel to work every day, most having to wake up in the early hours of the morning, leaving home no later than 4:30 to make the journey to start their work at 6. And of course, on the opposite side, after generally a 12-hour shift, they would then have to travel home, not returning there until 7:30 in the evening. So to him, the solution was simple: move production to the city itself, to make things easier on the very people they relied on to run the company, to get to and from work easier. Although, despite how incredibly kind this seems, especially for the time, it was not a purely benevolent move on his part. He planned to grow the business far beyond anything the mill in Stoke could handle. On top of this, the spot of land he had chosen in the Carrow part of the city was located right next to both the river and one of the main rail links to London. His final motivator for the move was there was a great deal of uncertainty they would be able to renew their lease on the Stoke site in the coming years. His decision to relocate the business would be a great help to Norwich itself, and the large amount of unemployed in the city, who had been struggling for work since the collapse of the textiles industry in the city, when much of production had been moved to the north of England for cheaper labour costs. Construction on the new site at Carrow began in 1854 and lasted until 1862, but enough of the new mill was built for mustard production to move to the site in 1856. Jeremiah saw this as a new start for the business, and time to innovate with new ideas, including one that is still visible in the world today. At the time, mustard was not sold directly to the customer. Rather, it was sold in powder form, in large wooden boxes to greengrocers. And this would be where you would go to buy it in whichever quantity you needed. Colmans followed the growing idea of pushing them into smaller, individual containers known as penny tins, and in his case covering them with a bright yellow, eye-catching label, to make them more distinctive and desirable to passing customers. And it was soon decorated with the company's new logo of the bull's head, first brought out in 1855, and would be one of the first company logos to fall under the Trademark Act of 1875. The company would also truly embrace the growing field of marketing throughout its life, setting up its own marketing department in the 1870s that came up with countless poster designs over the years. Along with mustard, he would also change the way his company sold its flour, once again going from large bulk to smaller individual packagings. So dedicated was Jeremiah to keeping an eye on his business at all times. He even had his own home, Carrow House, built on the site of the works. With his business and public life taking huge steps forward, he was not a man to sit back and idly relax in private life either, marrying Caroline Hardy on the 25th of September 1856, a woman just as driven as he was in doing all they could for people, even going as far as to opening the end of their wedding reception to the public to come and watch a firework display they were having. The couple would go on to have a very happy marriage, and would have 6 children together, among them Ethel Colman, the first female mayor of Norwich, who we will cover in future. Better connections by rail and river helped the business grow at an accelerated pace, and by 1866 Jeremiah's products were being sold in London and across the country, where he would come to the attention of royalty, with Colman's being asked to supply mustard for Queen Victoria herself, Jeremiah even being invited to an audience with the Queen. And it was during this meeting between mustard maker and monarch that one of his most famous quotes is to have come up. Queen Victoria asked him how he had made so much money from something as simple as mustard, to which he simply replied, "I make my money from the mustard that people throw away on the side of their plate." His royal warrant from Victoria soon opened his product up to other royals, from the Prince of Wales to foreign monarchs such as Napoleon III of France and Victor Emmanuel II of Italy, all enjoyed Colman's mustard. After his workers were settled into their new location, he turned his mind and efforts to making sure the same could be said for their children, opening a new company school on King Street near the Carrow Works, that at first had around 22 pupils in 1857, before moving it to Carrow Hill as numbers grew in 1864. Of course, at the time, education was not compulsory, but Jeremiah was keen that all should be as educated as possible, sending a letter to each of his workers with children upon the school's opening. In these days of progress, that man is sure to be left far behind who has neglected the cultivation of his intellect, while he who strives to improve his mind stands a fair chance of raising himself in the social scale. Remember the motto of your reading society: knowledge is power. Knowledge for advancement, power to be good and to do good, power to be happy and to cause happiness to others. It is of the utmost importance that you teach your children to be punctual, neat, and industrious. With the company school, his very forward-thinking attitude, especially for the time, would come into play. During the Victorian era, company schools were common, but they were not free, and they were certainly not advanced, teaching children just enough to make them good workers. But this was not what Jeremiah planned to do. He would cover the cost of the teachers' wages from his own pocket, although parents had to pay something for general upkeep of the school and supplies that were needed. 1 pence a week for their first child, and half a pence for every other child after that, with the school itself eventually growing to have over 300 pupils. And he was keen to make sure the children had the best education available to them. The Colman School had a curriculum covering everything from reading, writing, maths, geography, art, and even to scripture. Although Jeremiah was quick to make clear to parents that the religious lessons, or any class for that fact, would not be him trying to force his opinions or beliefs upon their children, like so many bosses were at the time, saying, "Nothing that bears the stamp of sect, party, or denomination will intrude." He would also turn to his wife Caroline when it came to setting up the school, who suggested the addition of more practical skills for the children to learn, such as woodwork, domestic duties, ironing, gardening, and even beekeeping were added at her request. Jeremiah had really found a kindred spirit in Caroline, who shared his belief that the money they made was best spent doing good. He had even written to her before their marriage to make sure she knew what she was getting herself into. I hope we shan't lead an ideal, selfish existence, for I am sure it won't be a happy one if we do. It wouldn't just be the lives of their employers while within the gates of Colman's that they would care about. At this time, especially among the working class, the rate of alcoholism and domestic abuse due to this was at a staggering rate across the country. In order to combat this within his workforce, Jeremiah bought out the landlords of 6 of the 9 pubs that were within a quarter of a mile of the Carrow Works, the area which most of his workers lived in, and he closed them down. Instead, building a large coffee house in Trouse for many of them to socialise with friends without getting drunk. Now, you could certainly argue that he was overstepping his authority here by taking this away from his employees, and this is somewhat true. But he was more than happy to give his own property over to them in return. He believed that everyone should have some form of garden, to grow vegetables for themselves and flowers to brighten up their homes. Of course, the small workers' houses didn't have room for gardens of any kind. So Jeremiah gave over parts of his own land for allotments to be constructed for the Carrow's workers. In 1868, they opened a work kitchen at Carrow that provided tea and coffee for the workers in the mornings and a hot meal in the middle of the day at a low price, only used to cover the cost of the goods used, while the company itself covered the wages of the cooks, and Caroline acted as lady superintendent of the kitchen. Caroline would also take up a leading role, looking after the younger single female workers at Carrow, where she would look after their laundry and find them lodgings, even setting up a clothing club, where she sold them material to make new clothes cheaper than they could buy anywhere in the city, and even employed a dressmaker to teach them how to make their own clothes. As with many jobs, working in Carrow was not without its risks, so Jeremiah insisted that all his workers must be insured against accidents or sicknesses that might happen, setting up a company insurance scheme, but also giving out a list of other places workers could use if they wished to go elsewhere. To care for any workers that were injured or sick, he employed a company doctor that ran a dispensary. For the cost of 1 pence a week, all employees of Colman's and their close family were entitled to health care when needed. This would evolve, and in 1878, Colman's employed the first industrial nurse in Britain, a woman called Philippa Flowerday, someone we will cover more in future, to visit workers who were either hurt or sick and unable to come into work, also visiting their ill family members, often taking food from the works kitchen with her when she paid home visits. And when she was not doing this, she was aiding the doctor in the dispensary. The list of privileges that Colman's offered to their staff would only grow, including the at the time virtually unheard of paid days off. The amount of these privileges available to workers were covered in a magazine, The Commerce, and included everything from working men's clubs and tea rooms to athletic clubs, cookery schools, libraries, saving banks, playground for the workers' children, staff outings, Christmas dinners, pension funds, and much more. He saw himself as more than a boss, wanting to be seen by his workers as their neighbour and friend. All of this led to a huge influx of workers to Carrow, growing from the initial around 200 at opening to 1,100 in 1869 and 2,500 in 1898. Jeremiah also oversaw the creation of a yearly tea party for all his staff on Whit Tuesday, where they would all gather together in his gardens, and he would go among his workers to chat and see how they were getting on. But of course, as the size of the workforce grew, this became impossible. So, from 1877, he replaced it with a paid day off instead, the factory workers taking this initial day, while the office staff getting theirs later in the year in September, the day after the annual mustard delivery had all been accounted for. Jeremiah's reputation for fairness would not just stop with his direct workers either. On the topic of the mustard and other deliveries, it reached a stage fairly quickly in Colman's that the farmers they brought their raw products from no longer haggled with Jeremiah over prices, for they knew he would always offer them the best price available and not try to rip them off. He was a positive thinker through and through, and among his favourite sayings when things got tough was, "We don't use the word can't at Carrow." Even for those who were no longer able to work at Colman's due to age, Jeremiah didn't throw them out with little prospects other than the workhouse, like so many did. He had homes for retiring workers built on Corton Road in Brackendale and in Trouse. Other homes he owned around the city were also used by his employees, including by the single younger women being looked after by his wife. where they offered them a low-cost place to live near where they worked, often decorated with a mustard yellow front door. Rather incredibly, despite everything he had going on running the business, Jeremiah was more than just the owner and runner of Colman's. He was a huge, influential member of the city's great and good. He was devoutly religious, even holding the title of the Deacon of St. Mary's Baptist Church from 1861 to 1870. Politically as well, his name carried great weight, being elected onto Norwich Council aged only 29, serving as both Norwich Sheriff from 1862 to 1863 and later the Mayor of the city from 1867 to 1868. He was talked into standing for election as a member of the Liberal Party, winning several elections, and holding his seat from 1871 to 1895. And although he was incredibly popular among his constituents, even being magistrate for Norwich and then Norfolk at this time, he did not do well in the House of Commons, due to his dislike of public speaking and a growing disdain for national politics. Holding his roles in public life with good humour, he remained humble throughout, refusing to lay foundation stones, as he quipped he wouldn't do a good enough job of it, or do it with the dignity that was required. He much rather spent his time using his position to stamp out corruption and bribery within local government. He was good friends with Prime Minister William Gladstone, who offered to talk to Queen Victoria to get Jeremiah a baronetcy, and given his achievements, personal connections, and already established relationship with the Queen, he would have been a shoo-in for one. But Colman refused the offer, saying, "Anything I can do to promote the principles I have always supported, I am glad to do. But I much prefer that it should be without the reward or rank a title is supposed to give." Although he was more than happy to accept the title of Freeman of the City of Norwich in 1893. He was on the Board of Trustees for Norwich Museum, and among the leaders of the campaign to protect many of the city's historic buildings. As well as also being an MP and magistrate, he was a deputy lieutenant and an alderman of the city, even serving as a governor for Norwich School. Saying of the reason he took so much interest in civic duties was, "Men should go into municipal affairs to see what they can do for their town, instead of seeing what their town could do for them." The list of things he did locally are really too long to be mentioned here, but some of the notable ones are being included in part of the launch of the newspaper, the Eastern Daily Press, that still is in circulation today, and leading the campaign for a preservation order on what was left of the city's medieval walls, which were slowly being demolished over the centuries. When his retirement came, he left Norwich for a home called The Cliff, in the village of Corton near Lowestoft in Suffolk. But he never really slowed down, or to be honest, really retired. He would wake up at 4 a.m., spending the morning tending his gardens, and the afternoon looking through the company books until 7:30 in the evening. Although he also carried on much of his civic work he had done in Norwich, building homes, schools, a Methodist chapel, and a village hall in Corton. Even in his later years, he was still a respected driving force for nonconformism and religious freedom in Norwich. Sadly, the final years of his life would be plagued with misfortune. His dear wife Caroline died on the 5th of July, 1895, aged 64, followed not long after by their son Alan, aged only 30. To cope with this, he threw himself back into his work, not only at Colman's, but also buying land to help with the building of an extension to the Jenny Lind Children's Hospital in memory of his wife and son. He caught flu in February 1898 that left him sick and bedridden for a long time. The May of that year would bring him yet more sadness, with the death of his good friend William Gladstone on the 19th. The final straw would come in September when his mother passed away. All of this piled onto Jeremiah, who had still not fully recovered, would lead to him passing away just 3 days after his mother, on the 18th of September, 1898, aged 68. The Norfolk Chronicle reported his death. "The city is deprived of a man who has ever been at the foremost ranks for those who have worked for its religious, social, charitable, and commercial interests. Freedom of religious thought and action was to him more than an empty, meaningless phrase." The whole city went into mourning on the news, and the day of his funeral Norwich came to a standstill. Shops closed their shades, the bells of St. Peter Mancroft rang muffled. In tribute, thousands came on the streets in mourning, with at least 1,000 people following his funeral procession through the streets. A service was held at the Princess Street Chapel, during which the priest conducting it, a man named Barrett, told of a conversation he once had with Jeremiah. When he asked why he did so much for his workers and for the city, Colman replied, "Money has its responsibilities as well as its privileges." He was laid to rest in his family plot in Rosary Cemetery, the first non-denominational burial ground in the United Kingdom. The mayor of the city at the time summed him up simply, "a citizen whom we could not replace." And this was most certainly true. In the space of 50 years, he had taken a mediocre-sized mustard business and grown it into one of the 100 biggest companies in the country, which now exported all over the world. Without resorting to the many of the less than ethical practices of the day, in fact, he had done all he could to fight against them. Even in death, his philanthropy was not finished. In his will, he set aside a sum of £2,000 a year for 20 years to help his employees, their families, and other charitable causes. This was used to set up a fully running pension fund for everyone at the company. Times have changed, and Colman's, like so many of the businesses that built Norwich, is now gone, with first the mustard shop and museum in the Royal Arcade closing in April 2017, and the Carrow site itself ending production in early 2020, with manufacture moving to Burton-on-Trent in Staffordshire and to Germany, where the Colman's product is made today, still bearing the name of Norwich, ending 160 years' connection with the city. Of course, there is a great deal of history between the death of Jeremiah James Colman and the closing of his works that is well beyond the scope of this video. But the work of Jeremiah, in stark contrast to the average 19th century industrialist, I feel should be long remembered. He built a global brand, without resorting to the low wages, dangerous uninsured conditions, and child labour that so blighted the Victorian era, undertaking social programs and ways of working that many at the time claimed were impossible to do and still turn a profit. It would also be dishonest to say that Colman's will ever be forgotten in Norwich. The site where the work stood is now being converted to housing developments, and the Museum of Norwich in the Bridewell holds several displays and artefacts telling of the history of Colman's, and a place we certainly shall have to visit before too long. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I apologise for the rather large gap there has been between videos recently, but I have to say it's very good to be back. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. This was Jeremiah James Colman, more than just a mustard maker, and this was a little bit of history.